So much of what we actually hear about healing sounds good on Instagram, yet it often falls apart in real life. You've got one camp saying just change your mindset, another saying trauma lives in the body. Then somewhere in the mix is spirituality, breathwork, therapy, and 12 different system hacks. And today we are exactly cutting through that noise. Welcome back to Healthy Mind, Healthy Life, the space where we connect science, real stories, and real strategies so you can actually feel better, not just sound better online. I'm your host, Sayan, and with me today is someone who has been sitting right at that space of trauma, healing, and heart data. Dr. Christal Badour is a clinical psychologist, researcher, TEDx speaker, and founder of Science for Survivors. For over a decade, she has been deep in the trenches of trauma research, leading large federally funded studies on PTSD and substance use, training clinicians, and publishing work that usually sits behind the academic paywalls. Now, she's bringing that research out into the real world, translating it onto language survivors, families, and communities can use. So, today we are really unpacking what science actually says about healing after trauma, how the brain and body changes, and what really moves the needle in recovery, and how we can integrate evidence-based tools with the spiritual or reflective practices in a grounded way. So, Crystal, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. And Crystal, with everything you have seen both in the research world and in the real world, I think we should start right at the foundation because before we talk about the tools or different systems, we talk maybe a little bit about spirituality. We need to understand what is actually happening inside of us. So let's begin there. Like I think we hear a lot of phrases like around trauma, like it rewires your brain and the body
Mm,
keeps from the score. But
mhm.
from a science perspective, really, what is actually happening in the brain, neurology, and the body after trauma? And what do people often, get wrong about that idea?
Yeah. This is such an important place to start. So I'm glad that you chose to start here. I think we can't really understand what's happening in the brain and the body after a trauma until we understand what happens during it. So our brain is really wired at its most basic core to keep us alive. And so when we encounter a situation where we feel like we might be in danger or there's the potential for future danger or we're being harmed in other ways, maybe ways that don't put our life at risk, but really violate our sense of safety or well-being or trust, that triggers a reaction. We talk about it as like a cascade of responses in our brain and our body
Mhm.
that are really designed to help keep us alive and help us learn about that situation in the most intensive way possible so that we have the tools that we need to, if we survive that situation, to protect us from encountering it ever again. That sort of cascade of responses is of course triggered in the brain. It's triggered in many parts of the brain, but largely our brain's alarm system, which is centered in what we call the limbic system. Many people have heard of the structure called the amygdala. It's kind of our fear processing center. Um,
Yeah.
and it also processes a lot of other important emotions too that people feel during trauma. It's involved in things like feeling ashamed,
Mm.
other kinds of emotions that we don't often talk about as much during a trauma, but they're are often there. And so those centers are very active and they're flooding our brain and our body with various chemicals, activating our autonomic nervous system, our kind of fight or flight system that is really aimed at getting our body moving, getting us responding to that situation in a way that's going to help preserve our life. And it's really important, but it also has some surprising impacts for people. So it actually changes the way, you mentioned, like, is our brain rewired? So in some ways, yes. What happens is when we get this flood and this reaction to keep us alive, we actually lay down memories in a very different way. So we might really focus on encoding certain details, certain sights or sounds or smells. We might have really vivid snapshots of certain parts of the trauma or certain components, but other things
Mm,
really aren't there and are kind of gaps.
mm, mm.
And that is all part of the brain's way of processing what it thinks is the most important information to keep us alive. But for some people, afterward, when they go back and reflect on it, the nature of those memories can be really distressing, that they are more like
Yeah.
snapshots, that there are big gaps in people's memory, things that feel like they shouldn't be there in something that's been so impactful, that can make people look back and wonder, like, is something wrong with me? Like, am I not, why am I not remembering everything that has happened?
Mm. That is actually quite interesting, the way you stated that. And so what you're essentially stating is it's kind of the brain's, survival mechanism. And when we look at that way, I think a lot of us listening to this right now are wrong, or initially what they thought the trauma is to them. And this is kind of a whole new perspective that you brought, at least to me. So, but here is where it gets tricky, I think. So the moment that we try to learn more about this, right, or say get some support, especially online, they run into this overwhelming wave of, we call it the healing content. And some of it is, I agree, is
Mhm.
genuinely helpful, but a lot of it is actually beautifully packaged, but not actually grounded in anything real. So
That's
for
right.
someone who is already feeling, in that and who's someone who's in that vulnerability, right? It can be confusing to know what to trust. So I want to zoom out a little bit. And so the next question then becomes, okay, how do I choose the tools that are actually good for me? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it can be really hard. I think your point about things being so well packaged and
Yeah.
on the surface, they seem really credible. But really, anyone can take out their phone and record a video and post it online. And
Yeah.
so I think it is
Yeah.
so tough sometimes to be able to piece apart what is useful information and what is not.
Yeah.
The place that I think can be really useful to start is there are several, particularly governmental or non governmental organizations that publish information that is grounded in the research. And it's designed to be more accessible, more digestible than, say, going to a scientific journal. It's really
Mm.
designed to kind of break down information about. Um, what we know about trauma, what we don't, what we know about recovery, and so there are a few, I'll just toss out some to think about. So the World Health Organization is a great place to look at. If you're for us housed in the United States, we have a few organizations. We have a National Center for PTSD, which even though it's housed in the U.S., has great information that can be really useful globally. Um, we have several different professional organizations for children in the U.S. We have the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that has a lot of information that can be really helpful for parents. So honestly, those are the places that I would start to get a little bit of information about. Okay, well, what's real out there, and
Yeah.
what's the real evidence say about maybe treatment approaches that might be most helpful, or if I'm not looking for treatment, maybe strategies I can try on my own to help with the healing process.
Okay, and what's your take about, say, generative AI? I think that's something that is,
Mm.
at the tip of your palm right now. People really love to go there and
Ah,
have a chit chat with AI in general. So, what do you think?
yeah.
Can you trust that information that you're sharing with the AI, generative AI?
Yeah, I think with any tool, it depends on how you use it, right? And I think generative
Yeah.
AI, we're right on the start of this, and I think we don't totally know what the impacts are going to be. And what I've seen so far in terms of how generative AI can maybe be helpful is directing you toward those credible sources. So if you're
Right.
asking
Totally.
AI, yeah, like where can I find helpful information? And it may steer you towards some websites or other resources, other groups. That's a great way, kind of an advanced search engine if you think about it that way. I think where we can run
Yeah.
into trouble though with generative AI is when we start relying on it instead of our our care providers instead of therapists, when we're trying to form a meaningful and connecting relationship,
Mm.
especially when people are feeling pretty isolated and they don't feel comfortable talking to someone. The truth is, we're talking to a
Yeah.
computer, right? Not a person. And the computer makes mistakes and can make people feel a lot of different things that might not always be helpful.
Yeah, and there's this thing that it's also stealing all the information that you're giving to it. That's a different thing
That's right.
altogether,
That's
which
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We can have
so
another
we'll
talk
talk
about
about
that.
that later. Yeah. But yeah, totally. I think that's a great way to start. At least, yeah, it can redirect you to some credible sources that are out there. And so okay, but you have worked closely with say survivors of severe trauma, including say, sexual violence and
Mhm.
substance use, and often their pain is treated like a personal failure, Crystal, instead of
Yes.
completely predictable response to what they have been through. So.
That's right.
If I have to frame it this way, how do you think our culture and our systems either support or sabotage healing for these folks?
Huh. Yeah, that's a challenging question. You know, I think it depends on, you mentioned trauma as well as substance use. I think
Yeah.
culturally, we tend to support people more following trauma if they have not used substances to help them cope with it. And I think that is an unfortunate way that we have often um, sectioned out mental health and substance use, where increasingly, I think there's less stigma around mental health issues and trauma recovery, and particularly as we increasingly understand the impact of like early childhood adversity on people's long-term lives. I still think we have a much longer way to go when it comes to understanding why people use substances and how that, for many people, intersects with their trauma history and other stressors that they've had in their life that people may start using or may
Mhm.
increase their use to help them cope with and manage many of the symptoms that they're feeling after a trauma. And one of the
Yeah.
things we've been trying to do is just like raise awareness about this isn't a moral failing. This is one of many coping strategies that people may use. And unfortunately, substance use in the short term can be really helpful for it can really actually help reduce anxiety. It can help
Oh,
people sleep, all those things, but it can kind of take on a life of its own over time. And I think that's the
yeah.
space where I've seen the most our systems fail us the most and sort of blame people for the situation that they find themselves in.
Mhm. So in short, no substance use, right? I mean, that's what we're getting at. Because definitely, I think there are so because I think it really plays with your I think dopamine levels. So on short term, it might feel great, but in the long term, I think you're just doing self harm to your body over time. And I think it also sets up something I really want to explore with you, Crystal, because
Mhm.
once people start building that kind of life, they often reach for tools that feel meaningful to them. For some, it could be substance for sure, but for some, it could be therapy. But yes,
Mm,
and these worlds are often, pitted against each other. Like you have to choose between science or spirituality or
mm,
ethics or intuition. But
mm.
in real life, people don't heal in those neat categories. So I would
That's
love to
right.
talk a little bit about how these pieces can actually work together. Without either side canceling the other out.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so glad you bring that up because I think historically the science about psychological well-being has grown up, I would say, separately from spirituality, and it hasn't often been integrated in. And many therapists are not as comfortable talking with their patients about their spiritual life and where they are in that journey. And it's really important, especially when we think about something like trauma recovery, because we've talked a bit about the brain and the body and potential symptoms that people may struggle with, but right hand in hand with that are spiritual
Mm.
questions that people often face about what does this mean about the meaning of my life, about my belief system, about sometimes relationship with a higher power. All of those things are really important. And many people may feel like I can't talk to my doctor or my therapist about all these things. I maybe need to go to my spiritual healer or advisor about one thing, and this is totally separate. And I'm so glad you point out these things are not separate for real people, right?
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah, yeah. So I do think it is a overall limitation, although increasingly I think the science is moving in the direction of recognizing the importance of integrating these things and ensuring that it's a major component of what gets discussed and considered in the course of therapy.
It's a very practical way, I would say, of putting it. But that also, I think, brings us to a very, I would say, bigger picture indeed. Because I think healing isn't just about, what happens inside a therapy room or
Hmm.
during a, a meditation practice. It's also shaped by the environments, right? So if you look around your families, the workplace, our community that we live in, and so much of the research that you're doing is about bridging that gap. Taking what we
Hmm.
know from science and making it accessible to the very people whose lives depends on it. So,
Yeah.
I want to zoom out a bit and talk about what would it look like if all these different aspects of your everyday life, say families and workplaces, actually understood the basics of trauma science. Um, and I think obviously like it would change for the better, but I want to hear it from you. How would day-to-day interactions change?
Yeah. There's this really wonderful model that's increasingly being adopted by organizations, including employers, and it's a trauma-informed approach is what that talks about. And the idea is helping not just people in the mental health space, but all over in different fields and industries to understand that people don't come to you as a blank slate, right? They come to you with everything that has occurred in their life and the things that they're struggling with outside of their work, outside of their other roles and responsibilities. If we're talking about kids, outside of their learning environment at school, right? And
Right.
so a trauma informed approach is recognizing it's kind of shifting, if someone's, say, having performance issues at work, sort of shifting the conversation away from old ways of thinking about things like what's wrong with you to thinking about what's maybe happened that has made it difficult for you at this particular time, and how can we support you to get the most out of this experience, to have the best experience that works for us and works for you. um,
Hmm.
and when we
That's
shift just
huge.
that way, yeah, right, just that way of framing and thinking about it, I think it changes the conversation to, I value you as a person, not just what you bring to this situation. And we need to recognize that from time to time, not everyone is always going to be at their best. And there are things we can do, very practical strategies that we can do to help people feel safer, to feel like they can contribute, that people have compassion toward them if they're having a difficult day, and that really, I think, helps to improve the overall well-being of all of our organizations and areas where we're connected.
Oh, that's huge. I mean, I'm glad that you brought this up, Crystal, and I think it's completely doable. So, for me, I think that's what I'm taking away from this conversation is that it's kind of like a small shifts in how we show up around us that can change the entire emotional landscape for someone who's trying to heal, right? So
Mhm.
it's not about you; it's about the person in front of you. You know
Mm.
so I think that's the thing that I'm taking away from this conversation, and I think that's the perfect place to wrap it on. So before we just close this out, Crystal would love to know for anyone who's listening to this and want to explore deeper into your work, where can they find you on?
You can visit my website at scienceforsurvivors.com, and we have a blog post there, information about all sorts of topics related to science of trauma recovery, as well as information about services that I offer as part of my practice.
Awesome, awesome, Crystal. Well, thank you so much. And dear listeners, I'll have the details in the show notes for you. So you can check them out anytime at your own convenience. And with that, we hit today's mark on this episode of Healthy Mind, Healthy Life. And Crystal, thank you so much for, talking about this complex brain science and making it feel very accessible, to the people who are not from that same background. And so if you're listening right now, guys, here's your mini challenge for the week. I want you to pick one thing you learned today about how the trauma affects the brain or the body and let it change how you talk to yourself. And when you notice a reaction that you usually judge, I want you to pause and ask that if this is a survival response, how would I respond to myself with a bit more truth and a little bit more compassion? So I want you to try this for this week. And if this episode sparked something in you, I want you to share it with that one person who might need to hear that they're, sort of adapting. And make sure to follow Dr. Christal Badour and check out her Science for Survivors to keep learning. And of course, hit follow on Healthy Mind, Healthy Life so you don't miss more grounded, science-packed, and heart-centered conversations like this. This is Sayan, and I'm signing off for today. See you in the next one.